The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the harsh, fluorescent lights of Hartwell and Associates' 20th floor office. I clutched my leather briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of the audit report inside. 3 months of meticulous work that would either vindicate me or destroy what remained of my reputation. "Mr. Thompson," the lawyer said, not bothering to look up from his Mont Blanc pen as he scribbled notes, "I'll be frank with you. Your chances of winning this case are slim at best." Richard Hartwell was everything I'd expected from London's most expensive corporate solicitor, silver-haired, Savile Row suit, and the kind of condescending smile that made you feel like you were wasting his precious time. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Thames, a constant reminder of how high above the rest of us he sat. "But the evidence I've gathered," I began. He held up a manicured hand. "Evidence? You mean your theories about financial irregularities?" He finally looked at me, grey eyes cold as winter rain. "Mr. Thompson, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen desperate employees like yourself come and go. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but the truth is rather more mundane." The words hit like a physical blow. Desperate employee. After 15 years as a senior auditor at Meridian Industries, after building a reputation for precision and integrity, this is what I'd been reduced to. "You were made redundant," Hartwell continued, leaning back in his executive chair. "It happens. The company downsized and unfortunately you didn't make the cut. It's painful, I'm sure, but creating elaborate theories about financial misconduct won't change that reality." I opened my mouth to protest, but he wasn't finished. "Between you and me," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "you were just lucky they gave you any severance at all. Most companies would have shown you the door empty-handed, especially given your performance issues in the final months." Performance issues. The phrase echoed in my head. I'd never had a single negative review in my entire career, never missed a deadline, never failed an audit. The only performance issue I'd had was asking too many questions about the discrepancies I'd found in the quarterly reports. "Now," Hartwell said, straightening his tie, "I suggest you take their offer. The redundancy package is quite generous. 6 months salary, full benefits continuation, and a glowing reference letter. All you have to do is sign this little agreement saying you won't pursue any further legal action." He slid a document across the table, non-disclosure agreement, settlement terms, and buried in the legal jargon, a clause that would prevent me from ever working in financial auditing again. The silence stretched between us. Outside, London hummed with life. Buses, taxis, the distant sound of construction. Normal people going about their normal lives, unaware that in this sterile office, my entire future was being dissected by a man who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. "What if I refuse?" I asked quietly. Hartwell's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Then you'll spend the next 2 years in court, burning through your savings, while Meridian's legal team, which includes some very talented barristers, systematically destroys your credibility. They'll paint you as a disgruntled employee with a history of paranoid behavior. By the time we're finished, you won't be able to get a job counting stock in a corner shop." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Face facts, Mr. Thompson. You're a middle-aged man with a mortgage and 2 children about to start university. You can't afford to fight this. You were just lucky to land on your feet after the redundancy. Don't push that luck." Lucky, there was that word again. As if 15 years of dedicated service, of catching errors that saved the company millions, of working weekends and holidays to meet impossible deadlines, as if all of that was just luck. But as I sat there, watching Hartwell's smug expression, feeling the weight of the audit report in my briefcase, I realized something. He was right about one thing. I had been lucky to stumble upon the financial irregularities that led me down this path, lucky to have the skills to trace the money through shell companies and offshore accounts, lucky to document everything before they could destroy the evidence, and very, very lucky that I'd never trusted my former employer enough to put all my findings in their internal systems. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in my cramped cubicle at Meridian Industries, surrounded by towers of financial documents and the perpetual hum of office air conditioning. It was 9:30 on a Thursday evening, and the building was virtually empty, except for the security guards and a few other unfortunates like myself who'd stayed late to meet impossible deadlines. I'd been working on the quarterly audit for our Eastern European subsidiary when the numbers first caught my attention. A series of consulting fees, perfectly legitimate on the surface, but something about the amounts and timing felt off. In 15 years of auditing, you develop an intuition for these things. It's like being a detective, except instead of following criminals, you follow money. The first red flag was subtle. $47,000 paid to a consulting firm called Baltic Advisory Solutions. Nothing unusual there, except when I cross-referenced it with previous quarters, I noticed the same amount had been paid 3 times in 6 months to 3 different consulting firms. Same amount, same description, different recipients. I pulled up the purchase orders. All signed off by Marcus Webb, our Chief Financial Officer. All for strategic market analysis. All paid within days of each other. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I barely noticed as I dug deeper. Baltic Advisory Solutions had an address in Tallinn, Estonia. When I looked it up on Google Street View, I found myself staring at a residential building, a small apartment block with no visible business premises. That's when the excitement kicked in. The thrill of uncovering something hidden, something that didn't want to be found. I'd always been good at puzzles, even as a child. My mum used to say I had a mind for details that others missed. I began tracing the web of payments. Consulting fees, advisory services, market research, all legitimate-sounding descriptions for money flowing out of Meridian to companies that seemed to exist only on paper. Shell companies, most likely, designed to hide the real destination of the funds. By midnight, I'd identified at least 12 suspicious transactions totaling nearly $800,000. But I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. Over the next fortnight, I worked like a man possessed. I arrived early, stayed late, and spent my lunch breaks poring over financial records. I traced bank routing numbers, cross-referenced company registrations, and built a timeline of suspicious transactions that stretched back 3 years. The picture that emerged was staggering. Someone at Meridian, most likely Webb himself, had been systematically siphoning money from the company through a network of shell companies. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below reporting thresholds, and the timing was designed to coincide with busy periods when other auditors would be too stretched to notice. But I'd noticed. And more importantly, I'd documented everything. The audit report I compiled was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. 47 pages of evidence, complete with bank statements, company filings, and a detailed flowchart showing exactly how the money moved from Meridian's accounts to Webb's personal offshore holdings. I should have known that making such a discovery would paint a target on my back. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I arrived at work to find my access to the financial systems had been temporarily suspended for routine maintenance. When I asked IT about it, they looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about instructions from management. Then came the meeting with HR. Sandra Phillips, a woman I'd worked with for over a decade, sat across from me with the expression of someone delivering terminal diagnosis. "David," she said, avoiding my eyes, "I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns about your recent work performance." Performance? I just uncovered the largest financial fraud in the company's history. There have been reports, she continued, reading from a folder, of erratic behavior, missed deadlines, and what some colleagues describe as an unhealthy obsession with conspiracy theories. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. Conspiracy theories? Sandra, I found evidence of systematic fraud. £800,000 has been stolen from this company over 3 years. She looked genuinely pained. David, I know you believe that, but believe it, I can prove it. I have bank statements, transaction records, everything you need to... That's enough. The voice came from behind me. Marcus Webb had entered the meeting room, his presence instantly changing the atmosphere. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from never having your authority questioned, he was everything I wasn't. Mr. Thompson, he said, settling into a chair opposite me, I understand you've been under a lot of stress lately. The workload has been intense, and perhaps we've asked too much of you. I stared at him, this man I'd caught red-handed stealing from his own company, speaking to me like I was a child having a tantrum. I know about the shell companies, I said quietly. Baltic Advisory Solutions, Nordic Strategic Partners, Atlantic Consulting Group. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Something flickered in Webb's eyes, surprise perhaps or anger, but his expression remained calm. I think you need some time off, David. Extended leave, perhaps. Get your head straight. Is that a threat? It's a kindness, he replied. Take the leave, David. Use the time to think carefully about your future with this company. But I was already thinking about my future, and it involved making sure that Webb and whoever else was involved in this scheme faced the consequences of their actions. That night, I made copies of everything. Every document, every bank statement, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. I stored them in multiple locations, cloud storage, physical copies in a safety deposit box, and one complete set locked in my home safe. If they wanted to destroy me, they'd have to work much harder than they thought. The call came at 7:30 on a Friday morning, just as I was making breakfast for my wife Sarah and our twin daughters. The caller ID showed Meridian Industries, and I almost didn't answer. Almost. David Thompson? The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. Speaking. This is Jennifer Morrison from Meridian's legal department. I'm calling to inform you that your employment with the company has been terminated, effective immediately. The words hit me like cold water. Sarah looked up from her morning coffee, concern creasing her features as she watched my face change. Terminated? On what grounds? Gross misconduct. Morrison replied without emotion. Specifically, unauthorized access to confidential company information and violation of your employment agreement regarding the handling of sensitive financial data. I almost laughed. They were firing me for doing my job, for uncovering their fraud. But the laugh died in my throat as Morrison continued. Security will be collecting your company laptop and mobile phone this morning. You are not to contact any current employees or clients, and you are not to remove any company property or information from the premises. Is that understood? I understand perfectly, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. And I assume Marcus Webb signed off on this decision? There was a pause. I'm not at liberty to discuss internal processes. Good day, Mr. Thompson. The line went dead. Sarah was standing now, her face pale with worry. What's happened? She asked. I told her everything, about the fraud, about Webb, about the threats disguised as kindness. Sarah had always been my rock, the steady presence that kept me grounded when work stress threatened to overwhelm me. But as I spoke, I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally fear. £800,000, she whispered. David, people have been killed for less than that. It was a sobering thought. But what choice did I have? If I stayed silent, Webb would continue stealing, and other innocent employees might lose their jobs when the company eventually collapsed under the weight of his embezzlement. That afternoon, I visited a solicitor, not Hartwell, but a smaller firm that specialized in employment law. The lawyer, a young woman named Claire Davidson, listened intently as I presented my evidence. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the audit report, pausing at the most damning sections. This is comprehensive, she said finally. If even half of this is accurate, you're looking at serious criminal charges for whoever's responsible. So you'll take the case? She hesitated. David, may I call you David? This isn't just an employment dispute. You're alleging major financial crimes against a senior executive at a large corporation. They'll have resources we can't match. Legal teams, private investigators, public relations firms. They'll try to destroy your credibility before this ever sees a courtroom. But the evidence can be challenged. Expert witnesses can be bought. And if they're as clever as you think they are, they'll have already started covering their tracks. I left her office with mixed feelings. She'd agreed to represent me, but her warnings echoed in my head. How far would Webb and Meridian go to protect themselves? I found out the next week. The envelope arrived by courier, unmarked except for my name and address. Inside was a single photograph, me entering Claire Davidson's office building, taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. No note, no explanation, just the message that I was being watched. But that wasn't the worst of it. 2 days later, Sarah came home from her teaching job in tears. Her headmistress had called her into the office and informed her that concerns had been raised about her husband's mental state and whether it might affect her work performance. Someone had sent the school an anonymous letter describing me as delusional and potentially dangerous. The letter included details about my termination from Meridian and suggested that I was conducting a harassment campaign against my former employer. It painted me as an unstable ex-employee who might pose a risk to students and staff. Sarah's job was safe for now, but the message was clear. Step back or we'll destroy everything you care about. That evening, as I sat in my study, looking at the audit report that had started this whole nightmare, I felt the weight of defeat settling on my shoulders. Maybe Hartwell was right. Maybe I was just a desperate ex-employee chasing shadows. Maybe the smart thing to do was take their settlement offer and try to rebuild my life. I was about to close the file when something caught my eye. A transaction I'd noted but not fully investigated. A payment to something called Meridian Property Holdings for $150,000, described as Facility Management Services. Curious, I pulled up the company registration details. Meridian Property Holdings was incorporated 3 months ago. The registered address was a P.O. box in London, and the sole director was listed as Marcus Webb. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The payment authorization bore 2 signatures, as required for amounts over $100,000. Webb's signature was there, as expected. But the second signature, the one that should have been from another senior executive, was a forgery. I knew because the forged signature belonged to me. They'd been using my signature, copying it from approved documents to authorize fraudulent payments. Not only was Webb stealing from the company, but he'd been setting me up to take the fall if anyone ever investigated. Every payment I'd traced, every suspicious transaction, had my forged signature alongside Webb's. If this ever came to light, I wouldn't just lose my career, I'd go to prison. The room spun around me as the full scope of their scheme became clear. This wasn't just fraud, this was an elaborate frame job, and I'd walked right into it by conducting my investigation. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to take its place. Not fear, not despair, but cold, calculating anger. They'd underestimated me once by thinking I wouldn't notice their theft. Now they'd made an even bigger mistake. They'd given me proof of their own criminal conspiracy, and proof, I realized, was exactly what I needed to turn the tables on all of them. The handwriting analysis took 3 days and cost me $2,000 I couldn't afford to spend, but it was worth every penny. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a forensic document examiner recommended by Claire Davidson, confirmed what I already knew. The signatures authorizing the fraudulent payments were forgeries, created using sophisticated scanning and reproduction techniques. Whoever did this had access to multiple genuine samples of your signature, Dr. Hayes explained, adjusting her reading glasses as she pointed to magnified comparisons on her computer screen. They've matched the pen pressure, the stroke patterns, even the subtle variations that make handwriting unique. This is professional-level forgery. Professional level. That meant Webb hadn't done this alone. He'd had help, probably from someone with specialized skills in document fraud. The conspiracy was bigger than I'd initially thought, but Dr. Hayes wasn't finished. The interesting thing, she continued, is that they've made a mistake. Here, in this authorization from 6 months ago, she pointed to a signature that looked identical to mine. The forger has replicated a signature you made when you had a minor injury to your right hand. See how the final letter drops slightly? That's consistent with the compensation pattern you developed when you strained your wrist. I remembered that injury. A stupid accident when I'd fallen off a ladder while cleaning gutters at home. My wrist had ached for weeks, and it had affected my handwriting in subtle ways. The problem for whoever forged this, Dr. Hayes said with something approaching satisfaction, is that this authorization is dated 3 weeks before your actual injury occurred. They've used a signature from the future, if you will. It was a smoking gun, proof not just of the forgery but of the timeline. Someone had been planning this frame job for months, carefully collecting samples of my signature and waiting for the right moment to use them. Armed with this evidence, I arranged a meeting with Detective Inspector Sarah Chen from the Metropolitan Police's Economic Crime Unit. D.I. Chen was a small, sharp-eyed woman with the kind of focused intensity that made me think she'd be very good at her job. "Mr. Thompson," she said, settling into her chair in the sterile interview room at New Scotland Yard, "I've reviewed the materials you submitted. This is quite an allegation you're making." "It's not an allegation," I replied, sliding the handwriting analysis across the table. "It's documented fact. Marcus Webb and his associates have stolen at least £800,000 from Meridian Industries over 3 years, and they've been forging my signature to cover their tracks." D.I. Chen studied the report, her expression giving nothing away. Finally, she looked up. "Assuming everything you've presented is accurate, we're looking at charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. That's serious jail time. When can you arrest them?" She held up a hand. "Not so fast. What you've given me is compelling, but it's not enough for arrests. I need corroborating evidence, bank records, witness statements, preferably testimony from someone inside the conspiracy." My heart sank. What kind of corroborating evidence? The kind that usually comes from undercover operations or surveillance, the kind that takes months to develop. She leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you. I think you've uncovered something significant. But building a criminal case that will stand up in court takes time. Time. The one thing I didn't have. Every day that passed was another day for Webb to cover his tracks, destroy evidence, or worse, disappear entirely with whatever money he'd managed to steal. But D.I. Chen wasn't finished. "However," she said, "there is another approach. Civil proceedings move faster than criminal ones. If you could get a court order freezing Webb's assets, that might force him into making mistakes." That brought me back to Hartwell and his dismissive attitude, but maybe there was another way. That evening, I did something that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. I called Marcus Webb directly. "David," he said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "I heard about your meeting with the police. Unfortunate business, that. Makes you look rather desperate. Does it?" I kept my voice level. "Or does it make me look like someone who's discovered your little shell company scheme?" There was a pause. "I think you should be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "Meridian Property Holdings," I said. "Ring any bells, Marcus?" Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its smoothness. "What do you want, David?" "A meeting tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. The Shard, 31st floor bar. Come alone." "Why would I agree to that?" "Because if you don't, my next call is to the Financial Times. How do you think Meridian's stock price will react to allegations of systematic fraud by their CFO?" I hung up before he could respond. Sarah thought I was insane. "David, this man has already shown he's willing to destroy people's lives to protect himself. What makes you think meeting him alone is a good idea?" She was right to be worried. But I had advantages Webb didn't know about. The recording device Claire Davidson had given me, for one. The backup copies of all evidence stored in multiple locations, for another. And most importantly, the fact that D.I. Chen now knew everything. If something happened to me, Webb wouldn't be able to cover it up. The Shard's 31st floor offered a spectacular view of London at night, but I barely noticed the twinkling lights spread out below. Webb arrived precisely at 8, impeccably dressed as always, but I could see the